She was 74 years old, alone on a cold Kentucky road, and she had not moved an inch. The trucks idled 30 yards away. The man in the expensive jacket was on his third phone call, and Dorothy Callahan sat in her lawn chair, hands steady, eyes forward, holding a line that everyone around her assumed she would eventually abandon. Then the sound came from the north. Low, building, filling the entire hollow like something alive. 12 motorcycles, one man taking off his helmet. And a question that nobody, not Roy Dunbar, not his crew, not even Dorothy herself, had seen coming. The morning fog hadn't lifted yet over Harlan County when Dorothy Callahan walked out of her front door at 6:30, coffee mug in hand, and stood on the edge of her porch to look at the road. It was the same road she had looked at every morning for 51 years. The same cracked asphalt that curved around the base of Black Bear Ridge, the same rusted mailbox at the end of the gravel driveway, the same smell of pine and damp earth rising from the hollow below. In Harlan County, things didn't change much, and Dorothy had always found comfort in that. But this morning felt different. She set her mug down on the porch railing and pulled her cardigan tighter across her chest. The air was cold for late October, sharper than it had been in years, carrying with it the first real bite of what the old-timers called a hard winter coming. Dorothy had lived through 67 Kentucky winters. She knew the signs, and she knew, looking out at that road, that something harder than cold weather was on its way. The letter had arrived 3 days ago. Thick, cream-colored envelope, printed letterhead, the kind of paper that cost more than her weekly groceries. Dunbar Land Development, LLC. She had read it twice at the kitchen table, once fast and once slow, the way her late husband Earl had always told her to read anything important. The second time was worse than the first. Roy Dunbar wanted her land. Not wanted, demanded. The language in the letter was dressed up in legal courtesy, full of phrases like mutual benefit and fair market assessment and timely resolution. But Dorothy had lived long enough to know what those words meant when they came from a man like Roy Dunbar. They meant get out. They meant we've already decided. They meant your feelings on the matter are irrelevant. Roy Dunbar had been buying up land in Harlan County for 3 years. Parcels here and there at first, small farms whose owners were struggling, elderly couples with no children to leave things to, a few lots near the highway that nobody had done much with. People had grumbled, but sold. The money was decent, or at least decent enough, when the alternative was watching your property taxes climb and your savings shrink. Roy had a talent for finding people at their most vulnerable and making them feel like selling was their own idea. Dorothy was not vulnerable. Or rather, she refused to act like it. The Callahan land had been in her family since 1923. Her grandfather had cleared the eastern field by hand, her father had built the barn that still stood at the back of the property, and Earl had spent 30 years maintaining the fence line that ran all the way to the creek. The house itself was nothing fancy. 2 stories, white clapboard gone slightly grey, a kitchen that needed new counters, and a bathroom that needed everything. But it sat on 11 acres of the most beautiful ground Dorothy had ever seen. And she had seen quite a bit of ground in her 74 years. Tommy had spent every summer here since he was 4 years old. He knew every trail on the ridge, every good fishing spot along the creek, every hiding place in the barn loft. He was 16 now, quieter than he used to be since his parents' divorce, and the summers in Harlan County were the thing he talked about all year. Dorothy was not going to take that from him. She was not going to take it from herself either. She went inside, washed her mug, and made her decision over a second cup of coffee. The equipment was coming today. Roy Dunbar had made that clear in a phone call 2 days ago. Not the letter, a phone call, because Roy liked to hear people's voices when he delivered bad news. He had explained with the practiced patience of a man who had done this many times that a surveying crew would be arriving on the morning of October 23rd to begin preliminary assessments of the road corridor running along the eastern boundary of her property. The county had approved a temporary access easement, he said. Everything was legal and above board, he said. She was welcome to contact her attorney, he said, though he suggested it would be an unnecessary expense given the straightforward nature of the matter. Dorothy didn't have an attorney. What she had was a folding lawn chair, a thermos of coffee, and 51 years of standing her ground on this particular piece of earth. She carried the chair out to the road at 7:15 and set it up directly in the center of the asphalt, facing the direction the equipment would come from. She sat down, poured herself a cup from the thermos, and waited. The fog was still thick enough to soften the edges of the tree line on the far side of the road. A mockingbird started up somewhere in the hollow, running through its repertoire with mechanical persistence. Dorothy watched a red-tailed hawk circle once above the ridge and disappear into the grey. She was not afraid. That surprised her a little because she had expected to be. She had been afraid when the first letter arrived, afraid in the quiet way that settles into your chest at 2 in the morning when you can't sleep and the house feels too big and too empty, and the future looks like a wall you can't see over. But sitting here in the middle of this road, in this chair, on this particular morning, the fear had been replaced by something steadier, something that felt, if she was being honest with herself, a lot like her grandfather. At 8:40, she heard the engines. 2 pickup trucks first, one white and one silver, followed by a flatbed carrying a piece of surveying equipment she didn't know the name of. Behind that, a black SUV with tinted windows that she recognized as Roy Dunbar's personal vehicle. The convoy slowed as it approached, and she watched the truck stop about 30 yards away. Roy got out of the SUV first. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and soft around the middle, wearing a jacket that cost more than her furnace. He walked toward her with his hands in his pockets and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Dorothy," he said, "you're going to want to move that chair." "I don't believe I am," she said. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man recalculating something. "I've got a county easement. This is a legal operation. My attorney is reviewing that easement," she said. This was not entirely true, but it wasn't entirely false either. She had left a message with a legal aid office in Harlan the previous afternoon. Roy's smile stayed in place. "Dorothy, I'm trying to do this the easy way." "I know you are," she said. "That's what worries me." He looked back at the trucks, then back at her, and she could see him deciding something. Whatever he decided, he kept it behind the smile. He walked back to the SUV, made a phone call, and leaned against the hood with his arms crossed. Dorothy poured another cup of coffee and listened to the mockingbird. She had been sitting there for almost 2 hours, and Roy's crew had been parked and waiting and growing visibly impatient when she heard a new sound from the opposite direction. Not engines exactly, or rather, not the kind of engines she'd been hearing. These were different, lower, more of them. A sound that built gradually from a distant rumble into something that filled the entire hollow and rolled off the ridge like thunder. Dorothy turned in her chair. Coming around the bend from the north, single file, were motorcycles, a lot of them. She counted 12 before she stopped counting. Big machines, dark and chrome, ridden by men in leather who looked like they had come from somewhere very far away and arrived exactly on time. The lead rider pulled to a stop about 10 feet behind her chair. He cut his engine. The others followed one by one until the road was quiet again, except for the mockingbird and the distant sound of Roy Dunbar's crew murmuring among themselves. The lead rider took off his helmet. He was maybe 40, she guessed. Hard-looking in the way that men who'd had difficult lives tended to look, with a jaw that seemed to have been set against something for a long time, and eyes that were currently taking in the whole situation with a calm that struck her as unusual, given the circumstances. He had a scar along his chin that caught the pale October light. He looked at her. He looked at the trucks. He looked at Roy Dunbar, leaning against his SUV. Then he looked back at her. "Ma'am," he said, "you need some company?" Dorothy Callahan looked at the man on the motorcycle, then at Roy Dunbar, then back at the man. "I suppose I wouldn't mind some," she said. Marcus Holt had not planned on being in Harlan County that morning. The Steel Ridge Riders had been heading south on Route 119, making their way toward a two-day rally in Middlesboro, when Craig Wheeler, riding second in the formation as he always did, close enough to signal but far enough to react, had spotted the scene from half a mile out and pulled up beside Marcus at a stop sign to describe what he was seeing. An old woman, a lawn chair, a road blocked by surveying trucks and a black SUV that had the unmistakable look of money asserting itself over everything else. Craig had a gift for reading situations quickly. It came from 15 years of contracting work in places where reading a situation wrong had serious consequences, and it had made him invaluable both on those jobs and on the road. What he read in this situation, he told Marcus, was something that needed a second look before they rode past it. Marcus had agreed. He didn't always know right away why he agreed to things. Sometimes the knowing came later, after the fact, assembled from pieces that only made sense in retrospect. But sitting there on his bike looking at Dorothy Callahan in her folding chair with her thermos and her cardigan and her absolute refusal to move, Marcus felt something shift in his chest that he recognized from long experience as a compass needle finding north. He climbed off the bike and walked toward her. "Marcus Holt," he said, extending his hand. "Dorothy Callahan," she said, and shook it with a grip that surprised him. "This is my land. That road runs along my eastern boundary, and that man over there is trying to use a county easement to begin a survey process that will end with him claiming a right-of-way through my property." She said it the way someone states a math problem, clearly without drama, with the expectation that a person of reasonable intelligence would understand the implications. Marcus understood them. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. "Since 7:15. He looked at Roy Dunbar, who was still leaning against the SUV, now talking on his phone and deliberately not looking in their direction. Marcus had seen that posture before. It was the posture of a man waiting for a situation to resolve itself in his favor through the simple application of time and inconvenience. "You got family coming?" Marcus asked. "My grandson is in school in Lexington. I called him last night, told him not to come." She paused. "He'll come anyway. He's a good boy, but he worries." "Anyone else?" She looked at him with those steady blue eyes. "There's my neighbor, Bill Patterson, but he's got a bad hip, and his wife is ill." "I didn't want to trouble them." Another pause. "I didn't actually expect anyone to stop." Marcus looked back at Craig, who raised an eyebrow. Marcus turned back to Dorothy. "Well," he said, "we stopped." He went back to the group and spoke quietly for about 3 minutes. There was some nodding, a few questions. One man, Pete Garza, who was newer to the group and sometimes needed things explained twice, who asked whether this was the kind of thing they ought to get involved in. Craig answered that question before Marcus could, in terms that were short and unambiguous, and Pete didn't ask again. Within 10 minutes, the Steel Ridge Riders had formed a loose line across the road behind Dorothy's chair. Some had gotten off their bikes, some had stayed on. Marcus walked back and stood beside her, and for a while nobody said anything. Roy Dunbar eventually pushed off from the SUV and walked toward them with the measured pace of a man trying to look unhurried. He stopped about 15 feet away, looked at the row of motorcycles and riders, and said nothing for a moment. "This is a private matter," he said finally, directing this at Marcus. "I'd advise you and your friends to move along." "We're not in anyone's way," Marcus said. "We're just parked. You're obstructing a legal operation." "The lady's been obstructing it all morning," Marcus said. "We're just keeping her company." Roy's jaw tightened. He looked at Dorothy. This isn't going to change anything, Dorothy. The easement is filed. The survey goes forward. Then it goes forward another day, she said, when I'm not sitting here. He looked at her for a long moment, and Marcus watched something move across his face. Not anger exactly, more like a calculation being revised upward in difficulty. Roy Dunbar had dealt with resistance before, clearly, but he was used to resistance from people who were alone. People who felt alone, even if they technically weren't, tended to eventually make the practical choice. Dorothy did not look like she was making any practical choices today. Roy walked back to the SUV and made another phone call. His crew had gotten out of the trucks by now and were standing around looking at their phones or at the tree line or anywhere that wasn't at the row of bikers watching them. One of the surveyors, a young man in an orange vest who couldn't have been more than 25, sat down on the flatbed and opened a thermos of his own. Marcus settled in beside Dorothy's chair. "You been on this land long?" he asked. 51 years, she said. "My husband's family before that, going back to 1923. "That's a long time." "It is." She looked out at the ridge. "Earl, my husband. He used to say that land like this doesn't belong to you. You belong to it. You're just the one looking after it for a while?" She was quiet for a moment. "He passed 9 years ago. I've been looking after it myself since then." Marcus was quiet. Somewhere up on the ridge a branch cracked, probably a deer moving through the underbrush. The October light was coming clearer now as the fog burned off, and the colors on the hillside, the reds and golds and deep russets of the Kentucky fall, were the kind of thing that made you understand why people fought for particular pieces of ground. "What's your story?" Dorothy asked. She said it the way she'd said everything else, directly, without apology. Marcus almost smiled. "That's a long one. We appear to have time." He told her some of it. Not all. Some of it wasn't the kind of thing you told a 74-year-old woman you'd known for 40 minutes. And some of it wasn't the kind of thing he told anyone. But enough. He told her about growing up in Corbin, about his father who drove a coal truck and his mother who taught second grade, about the years he'd spent after the army trying to figure out what to do with himself in a world that didn't seem to have obvious places for men like him anymore. He told her about the riders, how he'd come to them late, almost 40, looking for something that turned out to be simpler than he'd expected, just men who showed up, who kept their word, who didn't need much explaining. Dorothy listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Your mother must be proud." "She passed 2 years ago," he said. "I'm sorry." "She would have liked you," he said, and meant it. Craig appeared at his shoulder. "Roy's making more calls," he said quietly. "Could be calling the sheriff." Marcus nodded. "All right. We staying?" He looked at Dorothy, who was watching the ridge with an expression of complete serenity, as if she were simply waiting for the next interesting thing to happen. "We're staying," he said. The sun had climbed above the tree line, and the day had gone from cold to merely cool when the county sheriff's cruiser came around the bend. Sheriff Dale Pruitt had been doing this job for 19 years, and in those 19 years he had developed a reliable instinct for the difference between a situation that needed force and a situation that needed patience. The scene on County Road 7, which his deputy had described on the radio as some kind of standoff involving the Callahan property and a motorcycle club, sounded to his experienced ear like patience. He pulled the cruiser to a stop behind Roy Dunbar's convoy and got out slowly, the way he always did, giving everyone time to see that he wasn't rushing and didn't intend to. What he saw was 12 motorcycles arranged across the road, their riders in various states of relaxation, some standing, some sitting on their bikes, one very large man apparently eating a sandwich, one elderly woman in a lawn chair who he recognized immediately as Dorothy Callahan, and Roy Dunbar standing beside his SUV with the expression of a man who expected the arrival of a sheriff to simplify his morning considerably. Dale was fairly certain Roy was about to be disappointed. He walked past the convoy, past Roy, past the surveying trucks, and stopped in front of Dorothy's chair. "Morning, Dorothy." "Morning, Dale. Quite a gathering you've got here." "Roy brought the gathering," she said. "I just brought a chair." Dale looked at the row of motorcycles. The lead rider, big man, mid-40s, scar on his chin. The kind of calm that either meant someone was very dangerous or very experienced, met his eyes and nodded once. Dale nodded back. "These men with you?" he asked Dorothy. "They stopped to keep me company," she said. "I didn't ask them to, but I'm grateful." Dale turned to Marcus. "Dale Pruitt, Harlan County Sheriff." "Marcus Holt," Marcus said. "Steel Ridge Riders, out of Corbin. You boys causing any trouble?" "We're parked," Marcus said, "on a public road." Dale almost smiled. He turned and walked back to Roy, who had come forward to meet him halfway, already talking. "Dale, I've got a county-issued easement for preliminary survey access along the eastern corridor of this property. These people are obstructing a legal operation. I need you to clear the road." Dale took the document Roy held out, looked it over for about 30 seconds, and handed it back. "Easement's valid," he said. Roy's expression shifted towards satisfaction. "But," Dale continued, "the easement grants survey access. It doesn't specify that access must occur today, and it doesn't grant you authority to compel anyone to vacate a public road. Those folks are on public asphalt, Roy. They're not on your easement." The satisfaction evaporated. "Dale, I can ask them to move," Dale said. "I can't make them, not without cause, and I'm not seeing cause." Roy stepped closer and lowered his voice. "I've got investors who need this survey completed by the end of the month. This is a significant financial operation. I'd appreciate your cooperation." Dale looked at him steadily. "I cooperate with the law, Roy, not with timelines." He walked back to Dorothy and crouched down beside her chair so he was at eye level with her. It was something he'd learned early in the job. When you want to talk to someone honestly, you come down to where they are instead of standing over them. "Dorothy," he said quietly, "the easement is legal. I have to tell you that." "I know," she said, "but you've got some time." "It's not the only legal question here." He paused. "Did you really call a legal aid office?" "I left a message." "Call them again," he said. "Today. Tell them Roy Dunbar's name, and tell them the easement was filed with the county without your prior notification. That part of the process has rules." He held her eyes for a moment. "You understand what I'm telling you?" She looked at him for a long moment. "I understand you, Dale." He stood up and raised his voice for the general benefit of everyone present. "Nobody here is breaking any law that I can see. I'm going to ask Roy's crew to stand down for today and come back when this matter has had a chance to work through proper channels. Roy, I'd advise you to talk to your attorney about the notification requirements on that easement before you push any further." Roy looked at him with an expression that had moved past frustration into something colder. "This isn't over, Dale." "I didn't say it was," Dale said. "I said it was over for today." Roy stared at him for another moment, then turned and walked back to his SUV. He said something to his crew that Dorothy couldn't hear from her chair, but the effect was clear enough. The surveying trucks began turning around within minutes, the flatbed maneuvering awkwardly on the narrow road until it was pointed back the way it came. The white pickup followed. The silver one sat for a moment, and then it followed too. The black SUV was the last to leave. Roy didn't look at Dorothy as he drove past. He looked straight ahead, and the tinted window kept his expression hidden, but Dorothy watched the SUV until it disappeared around the bend. Then she exhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been holding something tight in her chest until she felt it release. Her hands, resting on her knees, were trembling slightly. Not from fear, or not only from fear. From the sustained effort of not letting any of that fear show for 3 hours on a cold October road. Marcus appeared beside her chair. He had appeared beside her chair quietly several times throughout the morning. She realized each time something shifted in the situation, as if he were tracking the changes and positioning himself accordingly without making a production of it. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. Then, because he was looking at her with the same direct patience he'd maintained all morning, "I'm a little tired." "That's fair," he said. Craig Wheeler came over and stood on her other side. He was a shorter man than Marcus, more compact, with a red beard going grey at the edges and the kind of eyes that seemed to find things funny even when he wasn't smiling. "For what it's worth, Ma'am, that was one of the more impressive things I've seen in a while. And I've seen some things." Dorothy looked up at him. "I was terrified the entire time." "Yes, ma'am," Craig said. "That's what made it impressive. Dale Pruitt came over before he left and gave Dorothy his direct cell number, which she tucked into the pocket of her cardigan. He shook hands with Marcus and said something quiet that Dorothy didn't hear, and then he got in his cruiser and drove north. The morning had turned into afternoon by the time Dorothy stood up from her chair, her knees protesting in the way they always did after prolonged sitting. Marcus steadied her elbow without being asked, and she let him. "You should come inside," she said. "All of you. I've got soup on the stove from yesterday and I just baked bread this week." Marcus looked at her, then at Craig, then back at her. "Ma'am, there are 14 of us." "I know how to make soup for 14 people," Dorothy said. "I raised 3 sons and hosted the Eastern Kentucky Baptist Women's Auxiliary potluck for 22 years. She picked up her chair. "You coming or not?" There was a beat of silence. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus said. But the real trouble, the trouble she hadn't anticipated, the trouble that would force a harder choice than standing in the road, was already coming. She just didn't know it yet. The soup was beef and barley, which Dorothy had made in large quantities since 1987 because it was cheap, filling, and improved significantly by the second day. She set it on the stove to reheat and slice the bread she'd baked on Tuesday, and by the time the Steel Ridge Riders had settled themselves into her kitchen and living room and back porch in various configurations, the whole house smelled like something worth coming home to. Marcus sat at the kitchen table across from her, while the others distributed themselves around the property. Craig had found the back porch and seemed to be conducting an informal survey of the ridge, with what Dorothy suspected was the trained attention of someone who'd spent time in places where knowing the terrain was a matter of survival. A few of the men were walking the fence line, not because anyone asked them to, but apparently because that was the kind of men they were. Tommy called at 2 in the afternoon. She'd known he would. She stepped into the hallway to take the call and kept her voice level while he asked rapid-fire questions. Was she okay? What had happened? Had Roy Dunbar actually shown up? Were the bikers still there? What did they want? And she answered each one calmly until he ran out of questions. "I'm coming down this weekend," he said. It was not a request. "I know," she said. "That's fine. Bring your warm jacket." When she came back to the kitchen, Marcus looked at her with a question he didn't ask. "My grandson," she said. "He worries." "Smart kid," Marcus said. She sat back down and poured him more coffee. "Tell me about your mother." He looked at her with mild surprise. "You don't have to." "I want to," she said. "Tell me." He talked about her for a while. Dorothy listened the way she'd listened to people her whole life, which was completely without preparing her response in advance or waiting for her turn to speak. She heard about a woman who taught second grade for 31 years in Corbin, who made lemon cake from scratch on birthdays, who had called Marcus every Sunday night until she couldn't anymore, who had told him the last year of her life that she was proud of the man he'd become, even if the road there had been harder than she'd wanted for him. "She sounds like she was wonderful," Dorothy said. "She was ordinary," Marcus said. "In the best way. She was exactly who she was every day, without making a big thing of it." Dorothy nodded. She understood that completely. It was Craig who came in from the back porch at 4 o'clock with a look that had changed. "Marcus," he said, "you should come see this." Marcus excused himself and followed Craig outside. Dorothy, who had not survived 74 years by ignoring the tone of conversations happening in her vicinity, followed them both. At the back of the property, visible from the fence line at the edge of the eastern field, a truck was parked on the service road that ran through Roy Dunbar's adjacent parcel. It wasn't a surveying truck. It was a plain, dark pickup, and it had been sitting there long enough that the engine had been turned off. 2 men were standing beside it, one with something in his hand that caught the afternoon light. "Camera," Craig said quietly. "Long lens. They're photographing the fence line." Dorothy felt the cold return to her chest. "Why would they be photographing my fence?" Marcus and Craig exchanged a look. "Property boundary documentation," Marcus said. "If they can establish that your fence line has encroached even slightly onto the easement corridor, they create a separate legal dispute," Dorothy finished. She'd understood faster than he expected. "Roy's not done," Craig said. "He's changing tactics." Marcus turned to her. "Do you have your original property survey, the one from when you and your husband bought the land?" "In the house," she said. "Earl kept everything." "Get it," Marcus said. "And the deed. And anything else that shows your property boundaries." She went inside and came back 10 minutes later with a manila folder that Earl had labeled, in his precise handwriting, "Land Documents, Callahan Property. Do not discard." Marcus took it and opened it carefully on the porch railing. Inside was a survey from 1973, complete and detailed, showing the exact boundaries of the 11-acre parcel. The fence line on the eastern boundary matched the survey line to within inches. Earl Callahan had built his fence exactly where the law said his land ended. "This is clean," Marcus said, and something in his voice was satisfied. "This is very clean." He took out his phone and photographed every page of the survey carefully, then called someone. Dorothy heard him say, "Legal question and property survey and Harlan County, and I need this tonight if possible," and then came back to her. "I know an attorney in Corbin," he said. "She does property law. I'm sending her these photos. She can tell us tonight whether Roy has any legitimate basis for a boundary dispute." Dorothy looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know," he said. She looked out at the truck on the service road. While they'd been inside eating soup and talking about ordinary people who were wonderful in ordinary ways, Roy Dunbar had sent men with cameras. While Dorothy had let herself feel, just briefly, that the morning had been a victory, Roy had been recalculating. The anger that moved through her was different from what she'd felt in the morning. The morning's resolve had been bright and forward-facing, the determination of someone who had made a decision and was carrying it out. This was quieter and deeper, and it had been building for 51 years of being exactly who she was every day on this particular piece of ground. She straightened her spine. "Marcus," she said. "Ma'am, tell your attorney friend to look at the county easement filing as well. Dale Pruitt said something about notification requirements. I want to know if Roy followed them." Marcus looked at her with what she was beginning to recognize as his version of a smile, something that happened mainly around his eyes and didn't travel much further. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I'll tell her." She went back inside to make more coffee. At 7:15 that evening, Marcus's phone rang. He stepped outside to take it, came back in 8 minutes later, and stood in the kitchen doorway. The riders had mostly gathered back inside by then. The truck on the service road had left around 5, once it became clear that the men on the fence line were photographing back. Greg had suggested this, and 3 of the riders with cell phones had spent 45 minutes carefully documenting the fence line, the survey markers, and the men in the truck, a record of the record-making that Craig said might matter later. "That was my attorney," Marcus said. Ellen Marsh, Corbin. She reviewed the survey and the easement filing. Dorothy set down her coffee cup. The fence line is clean, Marcus said. No encroachment. Roy's got nothing on the boundary. He paused. And the easement was filed without the required written notification to adjacent property owners. Dorothy, you were supposed to receive formal written notice 60 days before any survey operations commenced. You received that letter 3 days ago. The kitchen was quiet. That filing is procedurally defective, Marcus continued. Ellen says if you contest it, and if the county clerk reviews it properly, the easement could be suspended pending refiling. That would give you months. Dorothy looked at him for a long moment. Months, she repeated. Months, he confirmed. She nodded slowly. Months was not forever. Roy Dunbar was not finished, and she knew it, and she expected he knew she knew it. But months was time. Time for Tommy to come down. Time for a real attorney. Time for the county to look more carefully at what Roy had been doing with his easement filings, because Dorothy suspected, with the instinct of someone who had watched this county for half a century, that her filing was not the only one worth examining. I need to make a call, she said. I'll give you the room, Marcus said. No, she said. Stay. I want you to hear this. She called the legal aid office in Harlan and left a second message, more detailed than the first, with the specific procedural defect and Ellen Marsh's name and number. Then she called Dale Pruitt's direct number and told him what she'd learned. Dale was quiet for a moment on the other end, and then he said something Dorothy didn't expect. He said he'd been watching Roy Dunbar's easement filings for about 8 months, and that if she had documentation of a procedural defect, she should send it to the county clerk's office in writing, by certified mail, tomorrow morning. Dorothy said she would. She hung up and looked at Marcus. It's not over, she said. It wasn't a complaint. It was almost a statement of preference. No, he agreed, but today was not nothing. No, he said again. Today was not nothing. Outside the kitchen window, the Kentucky night had come down thick and quiet over the ridge. The stars doing what they always did over Harlan County, appearing in improbable numbers, filling up the dark with more light than seemed strictly necessary, as if the sky were trying to make a point. Tommy Callahan arrived on Friday afternoon in a 15-year-old Honda Civic that had once been red and was now more of an aspiration toward red, with a duffel bag in the back seat and the expression of a 16-year-old who had been worrying about something for 3 days and was ready to stop worrying about it from a closer distance. He found his grandmother in the kitchen on the phone, with a yellow legal pad in front of her, covered in notes in her small, precise handwriting. She held up one finger when he appeared in the doorway, finished her call, and then stood up and hugged him the way she always did, completely, without reservation, without the slight awkwardness that sometimes appeared in his parents' hugs since the divorce. "You look tired," she said. "I drove 4 hours," he said. "Who were you on the phone with?" "A property attorney in Lexington," she said. "Sit down. I'll make you something to eat." He sat down, and she told him everything, starting with the letter and ending with the certified mail she'd sent to the county clerk's office that morning. He listened the way she'd taught him to listen, without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You sat in the road," he said. "By yourself. For a while," she said. "Then I had company." She showed him the photos Craig had taken on his phone and texted to her. Photos of the riders lined up behind her chair, of Marcus standing beside her, of the surveying trucks turned around on the narrow road. Tommy looked at each one carefully. "Bikers," he said. "Good men," she said, as it turned out. He looked up from the phone. "Are they coming back?" "Marcus said they'd check in," she said. "He left his number." Tommy set the phone down and looked at her across the kitchen table with an expression she recognized from when he was much younger, a particular combination of worry and admiration that he'd always had trouble deciding between, as if he couldn't quite commit to either emotion fully when both seemed warranted. "Grandma," he said, "you could have called me." "I know," she said. "You should have called me." "Perhaps," she said. "But Tommy, I needed to know I could do it myself first." She looked at him steadily. "Do you understand the difference?" He thought about it. He was a serious kid, always had been, the kind who took questions seriously instead of answering them immediately. "I think so," he said finally. "Good," she said, and put food in front of him. Marcus Holt rode back through Harlan County 11 days later, alone this time, on a Tuesday afternoon when the clouds had come in low and the temperature had dropped into the 40s. He hadn't planned to stop. He was making a parts run to Middlesbrough, and this was the most direct route. But when he reached the curve on County Road 7 where the lawn chair had been, he slowed down anyway. The road was empty. The ridge was still and grey under the cloud cover, and the Callahan property was quiet, the white clapboard house visible through the trees, smoke coming from the chimney. He pulled over and stopped. He wasn't sure exactly what he was doing there. He'd thought about Dorothy Callahan more than once in the 11 days since, which surprised him a little, not the thinking itself, but the particular quality of it. He'd thought about her the way you thought about certain people you met rarely, people who seemed to be exactly who they were, completely without apology or performance, as if they had finished some long internal argument with themselves years ago, and the result was simply this: a woman in a lawn chair who would not move. He thought about his mother. He thought about the way Dorothy had said Earl used to say that land like this doesn't belong to you, you belong to it, and how she had maintained Earl's fence line to within inches for 51 years, not because the law required it, but because that was the kind of person she was. He was still sitting there when he heard a car on the gravel driveway. He looked over and saw a 15-year-old Honda that had once been red pulling slowly toward the road. It stopped at the mailbox and the window went down, and a teenage boy looked out at him. "You're one of the bikers," the boy said. Not an accusation, more like identification. "Marcus Holt," he said. "Tommy Callahan." The boy looked at him for a moment. "She's inside. She'd want to see you." Marcus looked at the house. A figure had appeared on the porch. Dorothy in her cardigan, coffee mug in hand, exactly as he'd first seen her. "You sure about that?" he asked. "I don't want to impose." Tommy looked at him with the particular expression of a 16-year-old who has had enough adult hedging for 1 week. "She made beef and barley soup yesterday," he said. "There's always extra." Marcus sat with that for a moment. Then he turned off the engine, swung off the bike, and walked up the driveway. 3 weeks after the standoff on County Road 7, the Harlan County Clerk's Office suspended the easement filed by Dunbar Land Development LLC pending review of procedural compliance. An attorney in Lexington, retained at a reduced rate through a legal aid referral, filed a formal objection on behalf of Dorothy Callahan, citing the 60-day notification requirement. The suspension was expected to last a minimum of 4 months. Roy Dunbar's attorney filed a response. It was the beginning of a legal process that would take longer than 4 months and cost Roy Dunbar more than he had anticipated, partly because the county clerk, having been alerted to the notification question on the Callahan filing, had begun reviewing Roy's other recent easement filings as well. 2 of those filings showed similar procedural irregularities. The county commissioner's office opened an inquiry in December. Dorothy Callahan did not follow every development in the case in real time. She had learned, over 74 years, that legal processes moved at their own pace, and that spending energy tracking every small development was a reliable way to exhaust yourself before the important moments arrived. She checked in with her attorney on Tuesdays, kept her certified mail receipts organized in a new folder she'd labeled Land Documents, Dunbar Matter, Active, and otherwise continued her life. She baked bread on Tuesdays. She walked the fence line on Thursday mornings when the weather allowed, not because she was inspecting it, but because she liked to. She called Tommy on Sunday evenings, and he told her about school, and she told him about the ridge, and they talked sometimes about what she might plant in the spring. Marcus Holt stopped by twice more before December. The first time, he brought Craig Wheeler and two others, and they spent an afternoon repairing a section of fence on the north boundary that had been loose for 2 years. Dorothy fed them soup. The second time, Marcus came alone and stayed for dinner, and they sat at the kitchen table after the dishes were done and talked until the night got late, about Corbin and Harlan County and what it meant to stay in a place when leaving would have been easier, about the particular weight of land and memory and the people who shaped you before you were old enough to understand what they were doing. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked her once. "When Earl died," she said, "for about a week. Then I walked the fence line one morning and I knew I wasn't going anywhere. What changed?" She thought about it. "Nothing changed," she said. "I just remembered what I already knew." He nodded at that. Tommy came back for Thanksgiving, which was also his birthday. He'd been born the Wednesday before Thanksgiving in a hospital in Lexington during a sleet storm, a fact Dorothy considered relevant to his character. And the three of them ate at the kitchen table, with the windows steamed up from cooking and the ridge invisible in the November dark outside. It was, Tommy said later, the best Thanksgiving he could remember, which Dorothy knew had something to do with his parents' separate tables in separate cities and something to do with everything that had happened in October, and everything to do with the simple animal comfort of being in a warm kitchen with people who were exactly who they were. On the last Sunday of November, Dorothy walked the fence line as usual. The ground was hard, and the sky was the particular pale grey of a Kentucky winter morning, and her breath made small clouds in the cold air. She walked the north boundary first, then turned along the east, along the line that Earl had built in 1974, that Roy Dunbar had wanted to argue about, that 3 of Marcus Holt's men had photographed and documented and confirmed. It was exactly where it had always been. She stood at the southeastern corner marker for a moment, where the fence met the old oak that had been there since before her grandfather cleared the field, and looked out across the 11 acres. The winter grass was pale gold. The barn at the back had a new piece of sheet metal on the roof where Marcus's men had found a gap and fixed it without being asked. The house stood as it had stood since before she came to it, white clapboard gone grey, smoke from the chimney, windows lit from inside where the kitchen light was on. She thought about Earl, who had built this fence and planted the apple trees along the south boundary, and told her that land like this didn't belong to you, you belonged to it, and how she had thought at the time that this was a very like Earl thing to say, poetic in the way he sometimes was, and how she understood now, standing at the corner marker in the November cold, that he had been stating a fact as plainly as he knew how. She thought about Tommy, who would be back at Christmas and had already asked if he could help with the apple trees in spring, pruning them the way she'd shown him years ago, learning the part of the work that couldn't be explained but only done. She thought about a man on a motorcycle who had asked if she needed company and had meant it. She thought about courage, not the cinematic kind, not the kind that came with music and recognition and the satisfaction of a resolved ending, but the ordinary kind, the kind that was mostly just continuing to be who you were, on the ground you were standing on one day after the next, the kind that looked from the outside like stubbornness and felt from the inside like coming home. Dorothy Callahan turned away from the corner marker and walked back through the pale gold grass to her house. The smoke rose from her chimney into the grey Kentucky sky. She went inside and started the soup.